Woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Dan Slott and illustrated by Oliver Copiel and Giuseppe Camuncoli, the first issue in the main event of Spider-Verse was published by Marvel Comics in November of 2014, with the finale issue being released in February of 2015. And no spider is safe. Across the multiverse, Morlun and the Inheritors jump from dimension to dimension, slaughtering spider totems until there's none left. But when the superior, amazing Scarlet and Ham, amongst others, band together to fight back, will they be able to win this war? Or is an infinite number of spider variants not even enough to save the day? This was another event that I read the full thing of, so I'm going to do this review a little bit differently. And that's good because there was a lot of big moments in the build up that I felt really added to this experience. Normally when I do an event, sometimes I do just want to rush and get into it, but I think Spider-Verse had a really good introduction. Straight out of the gate, I loved how this connected back with the superior Spider-Man, and Dan Slott also did it in a way that even though this was an issue 32 and 33, he didn't undo any of the work that he did during that series, which I was a little bit cautious of because I enjoyed that so much when I reviewed it a few months ago. In saying that though, if you're not familiar with that run, I can see this being a bit fillery, but I can only really speak from my experience, and seeing that Otto Spider-Man first discovering all these different types of spider characters was just phenomenal. There were also a few amazing Spider-Man issues leading into this, which honestly should come as a surprise to no one, but these were great because it felt like a calm before the storm. It set it up in such a way so that I knew where Peter was at in his life before we had all these other spider characters entering. Don't get me wrong, there's not too many connections to the bigger Spider-Verse story, but it's just a fun adventure between Spider-Man and Ms. Marvel, and we also get introduced into Spider UK, who I am fully ready to play if there's ever an upcoming movie role. Those early issues also let me just know where Silk was at, which was great because she was so integral to this entire story. So having that opportunity to catch up with her felt necessary because most of the time, I kind of forget that she exists. But it would have been so easy for this event to just be wacky spider characters fighting alongside each other, and don't get me wrong, there's still quite a lot of that, but it does make the effort even very early on to still have quite an emotional core, and that's something that carries throughout, especially when Mayday Parker's brought into the story, and it just set the tone very early on that this wasn't just going to be some kind of gimmick event. But let's be honest, do you think this event would have the same vibe if it's a similar concept but with Deadpool instead? No, and especially because Spider-Man's this character that often toes the line between being comedic and serious, this could have been an entire book that just ended up being, hey, look at the weird version of Spider-Man that we created. But the real build-up for me was in Edge of Spider-Verse. Some stories were hit, others were a bit of a miss, but in saying that, there was none that I outright disliked. But it's funny because when I reviewed something like Infinite Crisis, there was that point where I just really wanted it to get on with the main event, but this, the Edge of Spider-Verse stuff, was the type of preamble that I liked that just really got me excited for the main event. So yeah, you would get the same story if you did skip Edge of Spider-Verse, but I think you'd be doing a massive disservice to yourself. And I'm just gonna say, Edge of Spider-Verse issue 4 might be my favourite issue of this entire event. And you know what? It was honestly one of the best horror comics I've ever read. Although that's not saying too much because I haven't read many. Admittedly, it has got an unfair advantage because I am scared of spiders, but it was still suspenseful and tense. And even throughout the issue, I was changing my mind on how I felt about Patton, and it just made me feel really uncomfortable throughout. And I know I say this in a few of my reviews, but I could honestly see myself going back and just reading this single issue. And in a way, it did too good of a job because I was happy when we left that universe. But I enjoyed how in the end, he even gave us an extra layer to Morlun, and it made him not seem as bad. There were other great issues in this series. Of course, the Spider-Gwen one was phenomenal, and to address the obvious, because I was reading this after I'd watched Across the Spider-Verse, it was interesting to see how much of her origin story they kept intact. And to me, that speaks to the strength of the quality of the writing, that they didn't feel like they needed to change anything. Also, this issue was the most fun to enjoy from an art perspective, but I liked how all of these issues switched it up and had a completely different style and made them feel separate from each other. In a way, it was like a Spider-Man Black Mirror, and I am all for a series that follows this trend. However, there were a few other build-up issues that did just make me wish that the main event had get started, and in hindsight I probably rushed through a lot of the prologue when I should have taken it slower and actually enjoyed this controlled chaos. But this is one of those events where the prologue really did add to the overall experience, and I would recommend checking it out. It's why I'm also glad that I didn't just read the main event and that I did have this omnibus so that it was all there and it was mapped out correctly, and I was only able to get my hands on this thanks to Comics Bugle. In the past few months, they've been a massive support for this channel, so if you're in the EU and you want free shipping and free gifts with every order, then they are the only place that you need to check out. And if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get 3% off all items that aren't already in a sale, so make sure you get your pre-orders in, check what they've got in stock, and just make sure that you're showing them some love. And if you like discount codes but you're in the US, then make sure that you're checking out the channel's sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Jumping into the main event now, because that's what we're here for, and I have no idea how to start this review. I guess the thing that really jumps out to me is how well this event subverted my expectations. And honestly, I thought it was going to be a bit of a gimmick and there wouldn't be much more beyond that. But the longer it went on, I found myself more engrossed with the story. And it's impressive it managed to do that, because when I digged a little bit deeper, I realised the plot was a bit shallow. Not that that's a bad thing, but when you boil it down, this is pretty much, this family wants to kill us, so we should team up. And they try and fluff it up by adding in all these elements like the bride and the chosen one and the scrolls, but let's be honest, they are mostly MacGuffins. But anytime I pick up a book that I'm reading in my spare time, my main priority is to be entertained. And if you can do it with a basic plot, then hats off to you, because Spider-Verse was one of the most fun events that I've read in a while. It understands it doesn't need the world-shattering stakes that every other event promises to have. And it leans into that in such a way that it feels like a bit of a parody of some of those bigger crossovers. And I think the reason why that works is because so many of these Spider characters feel like they're more than just the concept. Sure, one might be a punk and one might be Indian and one might be from the future, but they still had an extra layer to them that made them feel like a real character and not just purely a stereotype. Obviously 616 Peter was at the centre of this, and it was great seeing him take charge and step into a leadership role, which is something that's often missing when he steps into these other Marvel events. Like, for as much as he was the most interesting character in Civil War, it was never him that was steering the ship, whereas here he was the one that was giving orders and devising plans. And it also added to his overall story because it made sense that from here he would go on to lead his own business. I also like that Miles just wasn't shoved down my throat in this. He is still the new guy, but nowadays it feels like if it isn't going to be Peter, it always has to be Miles. But at the same time, Miles still had a role within this that solidified him as a decent Spider-Man, and they actually did a good job of making sure that less is more, because pretty much everything he does in this is memorable. And I hope other Spider-Man stories take note that you don't have to get rid of every other character just to make Miles look better, because in Spider-Verse he did leave a great impression. I touched on them in the prologue, but Mayday and Silk were great in this as well. There were a few scenes where Mayday felt like she was being angsty for the sake of it, but especially with the Inheritors targeting her family, it made it so much more personal, which is surprising that they needed to make it more personal in a story where there's a family that's trying to kill every single spider. On top of that, there was a lot of great characters in this that left a great impression without ever overstaying the welcome. 2099 was fun as well, and I loved that moment where he questioned why they referred to him by a year, but admittedly his major involvement was in his own series, so it didn't feel like he was as present in the main event. And in a similar vein to that was Ben Reilly. I liked following him in the Scarlet Spiders series, but I'm in two minds when it comes to the tie-ins overall. I just didn't really appreciate the way they were integrated, but that's something that I'm going to touch on later. But because of that, he felt like both a key component, but also an overlooked aspect, which is just bizarre. Japanese Spider-Man, far and away my favourite Spider, and that's no disrespect to any of the other characters. But as a Sentai and a Tokawatsu fan, I am very biased towards him, probably more so than a guy from the UK. And everything from his entrance to the exaggerated dialogue and movement, and also just his mech, meant that he was the clear highlight of this event for me, and I just really wish that he'd get his own ongoing series. And let's be honest, it's not like Marvel's selective when it comes to printing Spider-Man books. But this is one of those books where story and character is so interlinked that by talking by one, you're naturally going to talk about the other. But the only other one that I'm going to make an exception for is the superior Spider-Man. From him reluctantly trusting Peter's leadership, to all the underhand comments he kept making, him coming up with all these ideas to help a team of alternate universe versions of his greatest foe, all the way up to the fact that he kinda knew that something bad was waiting for him in his future. It would have been very easy to mess up his inclusion in this event so that it just felt like a gimmick, but somehow they managed to avoid that. And in all honesty, they made him one of the best characters in Spider-Verse and highlighted what made him so great when he was in that role. And I'm saying that there's a ton of characters, and I'm definitely not lying there, but one thing that helped to balance it all out was the art. And especially when it was copial, there were such subtle differences that you could tell which spider was which, even if we were just looking at the eyes. He was also great at showcasing a range of different characters, which is something that I've seen a lot through his work. But it wasn't just the case that there'd be 3 people up in the front and everybody else would be a silhouette. They all got a little bit of the limelight. And I thought his work in House of M was phenomenal, and then when I saw him in Thor, it was like he stepped it up a notch there. But then coming to Spider-Verse, it's like he's gone up another level that I didn't even know he could have. In saying that though, he's not alone, and I feel like this is some of the best work that I've seen from Coley. I wasn't too blown away by his work in Darth Vader. It was good, it just didn't really do anything to wow me. But in Spider-Man, his issues were so much brighter than Copial's, which helped them to stand apart, but at the same time it wasn't a massive jarring change. And I can't imagine that taking the torch from somebody like Copial's easy, but but Cameron Coley still managed to bring it. In particular, the scenes he did were more exaggerated and dynamic, but honestly the art was great throughout this main event. I just wish it would have been a bit more consistent in the colouring, because the copial issues felt a lot more dark and gloomy, and they came at the beginning of the book, so it was a little bit of a mismatch. But if that's the only nitpick I can find, then this book's doing a good job. But the only majorly disappointing thing from either an art perspective or the story was unfortunately the villains. I just didn't find Morlun or the rest of the Inheritors that interesting. Sure, at first the motivation was fun that they wanted to eat these characters, but after that initial shock wore off, there just wasn't really much there for them. The only one I found a little bit interesting was that one that had been banished. If it wasn't for him, the villains would have just been a complete write-off, because it was fun to watch his journey unfold and see how it incorporated into the story, but other than that, the villains were mostly one-dimensional. They just felt like a bland version of the Hellfire Club. The motivation never really dug beneath the surface, and for me, I just don't find these big regal families that interesting. Even their dialogue was pretty basic, which is a shame because it was good throughout the rest of the book. Especially when it came to the humour department, it pretty much always hit the nail on the head, and despite the main characters all being different variations of the same person, they spoke enough in a different way that always kept it interesting. And there were a combination of characters that I wanted to see in a discussion together that we just never got, but I think that speaks to the strength of this book. And I think where this really got a chance to shine was in those Spider-Verse team-up issues where you had Miles Morales working alongside the animated Spider-Man, and they were trying to get the 60s Peter to work with them, but obviously so archetypal and set in his ways that he spoke in a different way. And there was a moment where Miles took off his mask, and then the animated Peter was worried that the 60s Peter was going to be racist. And that was one of the funniest scenes in this entire event, but it actually led to a more wholesome moment. The way it poked fun at the history of Spider-Man was great as well. In one of the prologue issues, Morlun goes after this black and white universe Spider-Man who's stuck in a loop and it's just always repeating the same dialogue. And it's scenes like that that just added a brief moment of levity whilst we're following a story that centres around a murderous family. However, I've touched on it already, but besides the Spider-Verse team-up issues, I wasn't really much for the tie-in series once the event had got started. And if I'm being honest, they were largely pointless. Don't get me wrong, it's fun seeing these combinations of characters where you've got Spider-Woman working alongside Jessica Drew and Silk. And in concept, these tie-in issues should work because it wasn't like one of those events where there's just the weakest link so that you can say it's a connected series. Those tie-in issues all had a mission so that they could help out Spider-Man in his plan. But more often than not, the main point of those tie-in issues would be summed up in the main event. And the Spider-Woman series was notorious for this. An entire issue could centre around Jessica trying to get some scroll off one of the Inheritors, but then in the next Amazing Spider-Man issue, it would show you exactly what she did in pretty much 2 panels. Or Silk would find a new universe, but then she'd tell everybody what she found in the next issue of the main event. Don't get me wrong, it's nice that he does that so that if you did skip those tie-ins, you're not really at a loss. But I did read those tie-ins and I felt like I was penalised for it. It was similar as well to Scarlet Spiders in 2099, to the point where I just skim read a lot of those later issues so that I could get back to the main event. The craziest thing is, despite those recaps, there was a huge death in one of these tie-in series that is barely mentioned in the main event. And it's not just of a little known character that they only introduced a few issues ago, it's of somebody that they really should be paying a lot more attention to. Why make sure that the finer details are touched on in the main event, but not the death of one of the most well-known characters? It's just so bizarre. However, regardless of what I feel should or shouldn't be read in between, I really respected the fact that once the final battle got started, that was all that mattered. And honestly, what a payoff this was. It was chaotic, yet still focused towards a singular goal. There was a surprising amount of emotion and heart carrying through this, and just some really surprising moments. Like, yeah, it was inevitable that a big fight was going to happen, but it would have been really easy for this book to just phone it in. And just be like, look, there's Spider-Man everywhere, so of course you're gonna care. Spider-Man here, Spider-Man there, what else do you need? Oh, we don't really need to write much of a story. Luke, here's another Spider-Man just to distract you. But each Spider-Man brought something different to the table, and this really felt like a worthy conclusion. There was also a third act twist that I didn't see coming, which I'll touch on a bit more in a moment, but it was just great that it had that epilogue and something left in the tank, and it was great because it took that time to have those calmer moments at the end where the characters said goodbye to each other and went back to their own dimension. And I just wish more events wouldn't be so reluctant to dedicate a few pages towards that. We're jumping into the spoiler section now, so if you don't want anything ruined, skip to the final verdict. And again, yeah, I might have recency bias, but Otto having that final act turn and trying to destroy Peter just put this event on a different level. I was fully under the belief that this event was over and done with, the Inheritors had been defeated, and I thought I was just going to be in for a pat on the back and they all go home. But it's clear that Dan Slott was thinking about what could give people the best experience, and having something to surprise us with this late on in the event just kind of proves that. Oh, and for anybody who's wondering what I was talking about when I was talking about the tie-ins having a big moment that just goes completely unnoticed, it's the death of Ben Reilly. Like, why was this not a bigger thing? He and Peter go way back, so I feel like they should have had much more of an impact. Especially because he did it for their greater good, it just feels like he got shafted here. The only other thing that I want to talk about in the spoiler section is the Uncle Ben Spider-Man. This was one of those twists that I really didn't see coming, but his character also just went on one of the most interesting journeys in this book. I loved his talk with Mayday and how he helped her to see a different way. And also his origin story and how he pretty much became the exact opposite of the Uncle Ben that we know. And when Peter first met him, I like how it was clearly such an emotional moment for him, but he realised pretty quickly that the man in front of him wasn't his uncle and pretty much was just another fighter in this battle. And it just helps highlight that this very much was a character driven event, and I hope that's the same when I come to Spider-Geddon, because don't worry, in case you were wondering, I'm gonna be checking that out for next year's season of events. This is my final verdict. And a few weeks ago I asked whether it's more important for an event to be entertaining or to usher in an everlasting change. And I wouldn't have needed to ask that question if I'd read Spider-Verse beforehand. On the surface, this may look like a gimmick that's trying to cash in on the decades of Spider-Man's popularity. But Dan Slott gave us something that's so much more than that, even if the wider Marvel universe goes largely unaffected. There's a variety of fantastic characters introduced, some of which have gone on to form their own legacy, fantastic art that helps everyone get a moment in the spotlight, and more than anything, it's just damn fun. And yeah, to play devil's advocate, the plot is quite shallow when you start to think about it, and the villains never really left an impression on me, and the later tie-ins felt more like a barricade than something that contributed to the overall event. But those aren't the things that I'm going to remember when I think back on Spider-Verse, and instead I'm going to remember how creative and fun the prologue was, giving us a different peek into these different universes and types of spider characters. And I'm also going to remember how rewarding the final battle felt all the way up until the last page, and yeah, of course, I'm going to remember Japanese Spider-Man. So sometimes I think it's important to have stories and events like this that remind us why this is our hobby. I don't need to have a midlife crisis every time I read a comic. I am here to be entertained, and this event, it did that for me. So I fully recommend this to anybody who's a fan of Spider-Man, or also just to anybody who's looking for a big action event that has a surprising amount of heart to it. But if I had to sum up Spider-Verse in one sentence, read this when you're feeling a bit burnt out with the hobby, don't get bogged down with every single tie-in, and it will remind you why you got into comics in the first place. But that's the video, and until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.